It's like an erotic charge that is constantly felt by the body. Mm-hmm. So these forms of bliss are part of the goal of the body.
Keep watching to learn more.
Book 3 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download all 8 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free, or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the siddhis, or powers associated with yoga practice. With me is Professor Debashish Banerji, who is the Haridas Chaudhuri Professor of Indian Philosophies and Cultures at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco, where he is also chairman of the Department of East-West Psychology. Dr. Banerji is the author of Seven Quartets of Becoming, which is his interpretation of the yoga psychology of Sri Aurobindo. He has also recently edited an anthology called Critical Posthumanism and Planetary Futures. Welcome, Debashish.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Always a pleasure to be with you.
It's a pleasure to be with you, too, and to discuss the siddhis. Interesting. It's a topic that's not frequently discussed, but it's of great fascination to everybody. And I know that in the Yoga Sutras and much of the ancient literature of yoga, the siddhis are emphasized.
Yes, indeed. So there are sections in the Yoga Sutra that talk about siddhis, and evidently by the time the Yoga Sutra was written, which is considered to be around the 4th or 5th century CE, the idea of 8 siddhis, Ashta siddhis, was already quite prevalent. Mm-hmm. And so they mention these, and they mention these as specific siddhis as well, and how to get at them just in passing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I understand that there's something of a divergence of thinking with regard to the siddhis, that the tantric traditions emphasize them more, and the Vedanta tradition of yoga philosophy or Indian philosophy tends to de-emphasize the siddhis.
Yes, to some extent, because what happens with a number of teachers is that they feel that the siddhis can be a kind of a deterrent to further progress, particularly in Vedanta. So if one is looking for transcendence, then these can actually keep you locked into, the exercise of paranormal powers, mm-hmm. which could be an intoxication in itself. So a lot of teachers will de-emphasize the siddhis, but most yogis develop siddhis at some point, and even the ones who are de-emphasizing it often have siddhis and mm-hmm. use them as well.
Well, it's not uncommon, and I think people reading through the comments section of many of the videos that I publish on parapsychology will right. see there occasionally people who report they have this power and they have that power, and you get the sense that there is a certain amount of ego attached to the idea that, right. I can do magic.
Yes, indeed. And yet, on the one hand, we all have latent powers, and it's part of human potential to explore these powers. And on the other hand, as you mentioned, Tantra actually looks at magic as a legitimate goal of human existence. One of our drives is to maximize our power over the world and over our environment. And so that's how Tantra looks at the development of siddhis.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your book, Seven Quartets of Becoming, you have really enumerated, as I recall, 28 different siddhis in 7 different categories.
That's quite true, Jeffrey. So 7 quartets, which is 7 fours, make up the 28. And this is really a way in which Sri Aurobindo organized his own practice of integral yoga in the early period. He's given a number of formulations of how one can get to an integral practice. And it can be open to the individual as well, how they want to organize their own practice. But his own practice was organized in terms of these 7 fours. And each one of these 7 is a discipline. And within the discipline, there are 4 fulfillments. So he's using siddhi in this broader way. But these siddhis include what we call paranormal powers, or what you might call tantric siddhis as well.
Well, why don't we go into some of the details of the particular ones?
Right. And so the way in which he organizes these 7 quartets is, as I see it, as I've interpreted it, in the form of a yantra. And a yantra is, as you know, a kind of an engine. It's an engine of practice. And it's diagrammed according to a certain combination of triangles and squares and things like that, which geometrically give us an image of the dynamics of the various energies that are supposed to be practiced. And so in his scheme, the 7 are broken up into 3 general lines of practice and 4 specific lines of practice. And these general lines of practice are, he uses the Sanskrit, but I'm translating it, the quartet of being, which he calls Brahma Chatushtaya, or Brahman, the achievement of Brahman, which is the quintessential Vedantic goal. And that's at one pole. At the other pole, there is the quartet of action, or how does one do purposive action in the world from a higher consciousness, from a divine consciousness. And in the middle of these is the perfection. So it's almost like a fractal definition. It's the quartet of siddhi. Sometimes he calls it the quartet of yoga. But this fulcrum is really that which connects the 2 poles that could be considered the pole of Vedanta and the pole of Tantra. And around the pole of Vedanta are 2 subsidiary or specific disciplines related to transcendence. One is the achievement of peace. So he calls it Shanti Chatushtaya. And the other is the achievement of knowledge. And by that he means knowledge by identity. If one experiences Brahman as the only being there is, then one can know things by identity of consciousness. So that becomes what he calls the quartet of knowledge, of Vijnana Chatushtaya. And connected with purposive action, you have the tantric, disciplines. One is called the discipline of Shakti, of power, and the other is the discipline of the body. So Sharira Chatushtaya and Shakti Chatushtaya.
Chatushtaya.
Chatushtaya means quartet.
I see.
Of 4. So each one of these have got 4, fulfillments or goals. And we can look at the general, it'll be maybe too elaborate to look at all of them. But just to point out how this system is working, we can look at the yoga, the central one, the yoga chatushtaya. And the 4 goals there are Shuddhi, which means purification, Mukti, which means liberation, Bhukti, which means enjoyment, and Siddhi, which means fulfillment of the latent powers. Mm-hmm. So, as you can see, just as the entire diagram is composed of an upper hemisphere that can be Vedantic and a lower hemisphere that is Tantric, in each of them you have 4 elements. 2 of them will be Vedantic and 2 of them will be Tantric. So liberation and purification are Vedantic goals, while enjoyment and the siddhis are the Tantric goals. This kind of scheme is repeated everywhere. So it's like an intertwining of the two going on.
It suggests that there's always a certain amount of dynamic tension between being and doing.
Very true. In a quintessential sense, you could say that. Or you could see that he's actually boiling down human drives. It's almost a psychology of drives to 2 primordial drives. One is a drive to transcendence, which really gets mapped onto Vedanta. And the other is the drive to power, to the maximization of one's power and pleasure, bliss in the world. And so these two are intertwined. Usually what happens is one of the, goals like that of Sankhya or of Advaita Vedanta, they privilege Vedanta over the other, the drive to magic, one may say. The drive to transcendence, which is our spirituality, is privileged over magic, and that's made into something demoted. And those who go after the drive for magic, they put aside the drive for transcendence. But he looks at that's the basis of understanding of the integral. That is, the two have to both be achieved.
A sort of balance.
A balance, and at a certain level, a unity of the two. And we discussed the idea of Maya in an earlier conversation. And that there are two, in Vedanta, there are 2 levels. There is the level of the undivided realm, which is called Vidya or knowledge, and the realm of the divided realm, which is called avidya or ignorance. So in Sankhya, the realm of ignorance or avidya is spoken of in a slightly different way in terms of consciousness and nature. So that which is conscious in us, which is completely free because totally conscious, is called Purusha and gendered male, while that which is natural in us and therefore determined by various laws, the laws of matter, the laws of animal behavior, the laws of psychology, that is nature, or that is called Prakriti, gendered female. So in Sankhya, they note that the two, it's a dualistic system. The two are separate from one another. They're intertwined, but that they can be separated. And they look to separate them so that the Purusha can be free of its conditioning by nature. While in Sri Aurobindo's case, he acknowledges that, but also puts them in relation and says that once each one is maximized, one can rise to the level of vidya, above the veil of Maya, where the two are seen as one.
I see. The problem that I have, and many Westerners possibly have with this system, is that it's very ancient, and there are many different systems being overlaid upon each other. So you have Purusha and Prakriti, you have Atman and Brahman.
True.
Sometimes I find it gets very confusing to understand all the subtleties and nuances.
It's true. And I think one of the interesting things we see with this kind of a scheme, and it's not only happening with Sri Aurobindo, it's the entire history of yoga. We see that there is a constant conversation with the past and with the different schools. Often modern scholars don't recognize that. They're either looking for purity of tradition or they're looking to create something transpersonal, which escapes from all that and gives a single scheme.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that it's a creative process by which these schemes are made.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that is this conversation with the past and the integration or synthesis of various systems that is constantly going on.
I've had some of the same issues in dealing with the lectures and writings of the Dalai Lama, where it's almost medieval in a way, like long lists.
Right. Yeah, but I agree, Jeffrey. So the interesting thing with Sri Aurobindo is that he's also at the same time trying to translate this into more transpersonal terms.
Yeah.
So that's the reason why in his texts we find these are his early approaches, and they are extremely rooted in the traditions. And he's creating his own dialogue, one may say, with the history of Indian yoga.
Yeah.
But his later writings are, he's creating his own more transpersonal language that lends itself to more modern understandings. And I think one of the things I've tried to do is to make these two systems converse.
Yeah. Well, let's start for a moment with the body.
Right.
The viewers of this series know I'm a parapsychologist, and I focus quite a lot on the paranormal aspects that are studied by parapsychologists, extrasensory perception, and things of that sort. But many of the siddhis, and I think many viewers would be quite interested in knowing what are the powers that are associated with the human body. They're not always even thought of as paranormal.
Quite true, Jeffrey. So, the powers connected with the body in this system, some of them are described through the quartet of the body. But then there are some that are described in other quartets as well.
Yes.
But I'd just to start with the body, the four that are related to the body, the four major goals of the body in this system are, I'll give the Sanskrit and translate as well.
Okay.
Arogya, is the first one, and arogya literally means freedom from disease, and stretched a little further, it means physical immortality. And that is one of the goals of many archaic systems. I think it's a goal of magic. Magic and alchemy are holding this up as a certain kind of possibility. Can we achieve physical immortality? The second one is after arogya, we talk about, the third one is saundarya, which means beauty. So we are coming to something slightly different. And in his scheme, everybody is beautiful. This isn't a kind of elitism which has a certain standard to it. He's saying that all expressions have beauty behind it, but to actually express the soul of that particular being is to express the fullness of the beauty. So how do we get to that is that individual's expression of beauty. Now, the second one I remembered now is uttapana, which is levitation. And so the term levitation here is a kind of a broad term he uses for many paranormal powers of the body. And they map to another quartet in the quartet of knowledge, which is called Siddhi. And this Siddhi or 8 siddhis is what we started talking about when we discussed the Yoga Sutra.
The Yoga Sutras. Right.
So the 8 siddhis are given as 2 siddhis of telepathy. These are called prakamya and vyapti, and I'll describe them a little bit as we go on. Then there are 3 siddhis of power, which means how do we achieve things by consciousness? How do we maximize our possibility of getting something? And they are called Aishwarya, Ishita, and Vashita. And then the third one is, the third set is 3 siddhis of the being, he says. And by this connects with the levitation. And they are Anima, Laghima, and Mahima. Anima is a siddhi by which, in Patanjali's system, one can grow small at will or even invisible. Mm-hmm. One becomes like an atom. Mm-hmm. In other words, one disappears. And Laghima is lightness, which ultimately leads to levitation. And Mahima is a kind of sense of greatness. You know, you may see that in certain cases, somebody may be actually very short, but they give an impression of being very great. So it's this impression of greatness, which is Mahima. So these are part of the large scheme. And then the body's, the fourth goal of the body is bliss. So there are 5 forms of physical bliss that he's talking about, that he sees as occurring through our connections with the world, but also in a sense coursing through the body all the time. Mm-hmm. And these 5 forms of bliss are given as Rodrananda. Rodrananda is like the bliss of pain. In other words, you know, when something happens to us where we feel extremely intense, something very intense acting on the body, we feel pain.
Yes.
But he's saying that that's because of the limitation of the body, that could be an intensity of bliss. Mm-hmm. And it's also related to one's relationship with the world as, how do we look at it? As an enemy or as a friend or as a lover, etc. So a really interesting example, he writes a poem about this, is when he gets bitten by a scorpion. This is an actual event that...
now you're referring to Aurobindo.
Sri Aurobindo, right. He got bit by a scorpion and later wrote a poem about this where these lines occur. He says, the mind ensnared by forms thought of a scorpion, but the heart rejoiced in lovers' contact. So this is what's happening. He's experiencing it as a kind of rapture or bliss, as if in the disguise of a scorpion, the divine is actually contacting him as a lover. So you see, that's a kind of a experience of bliss. The pain becomes a form of bliss. Then there is a kind of a bliss called Vaidyutananda, which he says is a coursing of a kind of electricity throughout the body. Then there is one called, the Tivrananda, and that is the hair standing on end. A lot of, adrenaline charge causes that. So, but one can feel that sort of bliss all the time, a thrill all the time. And then there is something called Vishayananda, which is the bliss of contact with material things. And finally, there's Maithunananda, which can be translated as sexual bliss, or it's like an erotic charge that is constantly felt by the body. So these forms of bliss are part of the goal of the body, of the Sharira Chatushta. So these paranormal powers of longevity and achievement of immortality, powers of bliss, and the siddhis. These are the goals of Tantra.
And some of these things may seem like completely outside the realm of possibility for people, but I know there are many accounts that would attest to them. An autobiography of a yoga, Yogananda, writes about a figure he calls Babaji, who is supposedly thousands of years old.
Sure. And there's an entire tradition in the South of what are called the Siddha Yogas, Siddha Yogis of the South, that are considered to have achieved immortality, or at least that was their goal. So these become goals of yoga in a sense, and they become part of his scheme as well.
And there are Westerners I know of who have written books about encounters with some of these beings who, in addition to supposedly being, there was a woman named Sandra Ray, as I recall, who wrote a book about this, about Babaji, the same Babaji that Yogananda
People have
refers
had
to.
encounters with some of these beings.
Yes.
One could even say the life of Christ. Christ himself could be considered one of these yogis who achieved immortality. And people have had encounters with the astral body of Christ, including people like Sri Ramakrishna.
But now, astral body and physical
body, right. It's different. I agree. So physical immortality, and to what extent, what is the dividing line between the astral and the physical? It's also, it's a question. It's a question.
It's a deep question.
It's a deep question.
I agree. There is a term imaginal that is sometimes used by the philosopher Henri Corbin to refer to an ontologically real level of reality.
Yes.
It's not imaginary, but it's not physical either.
Right. And I think there is a kind of almost like a kind of transition from one. There isn't a kind of a cut and dry difference between the two. In the Indian systems, when they refer to body, and this happens in the medical systems as well, body is referred to as a conglomerate of what we might call a gross part, sthula, and a subtle part, sukshma. So there's a subtle body and a gross body that are connected, and there is a kind of a transition from the one to the other. It's almost like, in quantum physics, we don't know whether a thing is definite or not. It's a probability distribution.
Yes.
So the body is in a way like that. It's a probability distribution from the subtle to the gross.
Well, and that's really how it's perceived in the Sanskrit traditions.
Yes, it is, indeed. And I think whether one achieves these goals or not, I mean, in the Sri Aurobindo system, in his diaries, I think he was aiming at these goals, and he was carrying out a certain kind of discipline and a recording of the successes and failures.
In his yoga journal.
So that he was pushing the limits. And I think he was doing this to some extent to demonstrate that all of us can do this. We can work at it. We can experiment with our own powers. And whether we achieve it or not is a secondary thing. But how far can we go with it? This is an individual journey.
Well, so by keeping this yoga diary, would you say that Aurobindo is encouraging people to do likewise, to make a diary of their own paranormal experiences?
Yes, Jeff. I'm not sure whether he thought of it in terms of something that others ought to do, but I think he did think of it in terms of what James would call a radical empiricism.
Radical empiricism.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is he had read James. I mean, you can see connections in his writings where he's distinctly taking certain things from James.
William James. The founder of American psychology.
Right.
Yeah.
So it isn't that he's doing this in isolation. He, to some extent, he's a modern yogi who's engaging with traditional practices with a modern outlook.
Yeah. Now, some years ago, I interviewed a woman you probably know, Judith Cornell. I think she teaches or used to teach at CIIS, the university where you are. And she was working with a female spiritual teacher known as, I think the name was Anandamaya Ma.
Okay.
And she said, this is a woman who was renowned throughout the world for hugging people. People would come to her by the thousands, and she'd hug each and every one.
Right. Amritananda Mai, or also called Ammachi, generally. She has a very large following. She's from South India, from Kerala. And she's famous because she hugs people.
Yes.
And is considered to embody a divine power, divine goddess power.
Yes.
And this is very interesting because we were talking about the goals of Tantra.
Yeah.
And I think, one of the really important, maybe the central goal of Tantra is to embody the goddess. So it's really to be possessed by the goddess. Possession. I think Tantra goes back to very early cults where people were trying to attain possession by divine beings. Mm-hmm. So to be possessed by the goddess is really a goal of Tantra. And she embodies that to some extent. Mm-hmm. And in Sri Aurobindo's scheme, as I said, the other side of action is the quartet of Shakti, or of power. Mm-hmm. And one of the goals there is exactly this. It's called Chandi Bhava. He uses 3 terms for it: Chandi Bhava, Devi Bhava, or Devi Prakriti. And each of these means essentially for him to become a vessel or a channel for the Divine Mother, mm-hmm. To the extent that she possesses the human instrument down to the cells of the body, mm-hmm. and radiates the kind of physical emanation of mm-hmm. The goddess.
And of course, when I use the word hug, that right. describes what it might look like if you're watching.
Right.
But from the inside, I understand that right. in this situation, this particular person whose name I can't quite pronounce.
Yeah, Amritanandamayi, yeah.
Was in a state of constant bliss. In fact, it was described as constant orgasmic bliss.
It's very possible, yes.
I mean, these are things that are pretty much unheard of in the West.
True. Because I think the full possession by divine power it goes down to the physical body, and the 5 forms of bliss that Sri Aurobindo is talking about are being experienced mm-hmm. on a constant basis there.
Yeah. Well, would you say that because of your study of Sanskrit and your exposure throughout pretty much your whole life mm-hmm. to this knowledge tradition that it's made you personally more open to receiving these gifts?
Certainly. I think growing up in India and learning this language, being familiar to some extent with the traditions, made it much easier to be open to these possibilities. Mm-hmm. And I see coming to the West that, of course, there's also the whole issue of modernity and the kind of division that modernity brings into our minds, so that it's a much more materialistic understanding that we are invested in, mm-hmm. That makes it very difficult to open to these possibilities. But in India, you talked about the autobiography of a yogi.
Yes.
You see there that Yogananda grew up seeing these kinds of people all the time. Mm-hmm. Now, one doesn't do that. Even when I was a child, I used to go to Dakshineshwar, where Sri Ramakrishna lived. And I remember there were many yogis there that they used to be traveling yogis. Mm-hmm. But if you go there today, the number of yogis has diminished considerably, and it's become a middle-class place, a place of middle-class pilgrimage. So I think there's been a change, and there's a different kind of more devotional attitude, but also an attitude where these subtler powers have receded a little. But I think still in India, there's sufficient openness to these possibilities mm-hmm. just under the surface.
Well, let me ask another probing question. India was, of course, colonized by the British and sure. I think to some extent by the French.
Yes.
Did that colonization cause the practitioners of yoga and other disciplines to begin to question, the authenticity, the validity of these traditions? Like, how is it that we have a tradition that gives us all these powers and yet these outsiders can come in and rule us?
Very, very true, Jeffrey. So what happens during the nationalist period mm-hmm. is quite a few of the yogis are actually at work to help bring about, freedom from these people.
Yeah.
And Sri Aurobindo's own entry into yoga mm-hmm. takes place through asking a question like the one because he was brought up in England. Yes. This is also part of the circumstance of colonization, mm-hmm. That his father became an Anglophile. He wanted his children to be educated in England, send them to England. When he came back, he saw examples of this kind. He saw examples. he was in West India, in Baroda, and his younger brother came there and started suffering from malaria, a very virulent form of malaria. And there was a yogi beggar who came to the door and saw the brother lying on the bed and said, "What's happened to him?" And he was told he had malaria. So he said, "Bring me a glass of water." And so they brought him a glass of water. He took a knife and cut a design on the water and read a mantra and gave it to him. He drank it and the malaria disappeared. So for Sri Aurobindo at that time, he didn't have any background in all this, he began thinking, is it possible to develop these kinds of powers? And can they be utilized to help us win freedom from colonization?
Yeah.
So this is really his entry into yoga. And I think, there were yogis. I think one of his teachers was closely connected with nationalism. His first teacher, who gave him spiritual experiences. So I think these kinds of sort of activities were being used in India to achieve its freedom to some extent.
That's very interesting.
Another side of that, Jeffrey, which is, I think, really pertinent. The Hatha Yoga tradition, which is the tradition of physical yoga, which today has spread all over the West as the yoga studio culture, begins in modern times during the Indian nationalism. And it begins as a form of body politics. Because when you're actually being colonized, then you have to develop tolerance in the body. You have to be able to withstand the colonization of the body. So essentially, these schools started sprouting up where teachers were teaching others on how they could use these forms of physical practice to resist the British and their imprisonment or their beatings and things like that, and not feel anything. So this is one way by which, they couldn't break the spirit of the freedom fighters because they were practicing these things.
I see. So the yoga studio movement began in India, really, and then emerged here?
Yeah, it wasn't a yoga studio movement, but that's in a way, the paradoxical situation that it began as an anti-colonial and a kind of a political movement.
I see.
But now it has become a kind of a consumer movement.
In other words, under the British colonization, people in India, like Aurobindo's father, became Anglophiles and maybe lost touch with their own traditions.
Right, true. On the other hand, you had some people who were bringing the traditions, they were reinventing the traditions in a modern form.
Yeah, and I know at the same time you had scholars coming over from England and other countries who were looking at Tantra and yoga and were amazed and said, we really need to study this. And
right, like Sir John Woodruff, for example. And, of course, there is some distortion that also happened as a result of that process because there was some dumbing down and some orientalizing and things like that also happened. But it made it possible for these knowledges to resurface. And I think this is the way in which we can revisit our understanding of a greater psychology.
I mean, I presume that some people might say that the proper application of the tantric approach is to develop these powers, and India should colonize Britain.
Yeah, that would be an inversion of the entire thing. But I think tantric, and ethics comes with this as well. And I think that's part of the reason why some of the teachers don't want you to practice these things to the exclusion of greater goals. I think the ethics that comes with it is the ethics of the equality of all human beings, harmlessness or nonviolence, the ability to do good.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Vedanta brings some of these things into it. And there's been a close relationship between Tantra and Vedanta, so that the necessity of utilizing powers for good, for the benefit of the whole human race, becomes a kind of a greater goal within these systems.
And the amazing thing, when I think about the liberation of India from colonial rule, is that it happened nonviolently. I mean, the British were violent. I know there were massacres, I did an interview with Stephen Schwartz about the Salt March and how the followers of Gandhi just stood there and allowed themselves to be clubbed by the British
Yes, some
soldiers.
of these people were practicing Hatha Yoga, and that's what gave them the endurance. But I think, it's true that nonviolence played a very important part, but there was a violent side to it as well, which particularly in the early period with people like Aurobindo and others in the Bengal movement, they did cultivate a kind of an extremist movement as well, which was also influenced by these kinds of goals. But it wasn't so as to invert the entire system and colonize others. It was to get the colonials out, to decolonize, and then to allow a more egalitarian system to emerge.
But I think it's also fair to point out that the nonviolence advocated by Gandhi, I think it's called ahimsa, was adopted by Martin Luther King.
True.
Became the basis of the American civil rights movement. So there is a kind of reverse colonization of a positive,
in that sense, of a positive kind.
Yes.
Right.
So, and so in a way, when we talk about the siddhis of the body, the ability to engage in nonviolent political action, is that considered a siddhi?
That would be considered a siddhi as well. Certainly. In some schools that would be considered, like we were talking about, converting pain to bliss. So somebody who can do that can experience these forms of oppression and be able to withstand them, and not even just withstand them as toleration, but as forms of bliss, as actual forms of exaltation. And I think those are siddhis as well.
That's interesting. Now, I practiced a little bit of Buddhist Vipassana meditation, where they talk about aversions and attractions. And if you're feeling some discomfort, just realize it's not you. It's just your body. Your nerves are firing signals to which you have an aversion.
You can do that. So there's a distance that takes place. And your consciousness is able to observe this and not feel that it is being affected with something else. So you create a certain kind of withdrawal. And though there is it's almost like distancing. If you can if you put on earplugs, then the sound is going on all the same, but you hear it in a very muffled way. It gets reduced. So these exercises can reduce in that same way, distance the effects on the nerves of the impact of from the outside.
Now, I know we could talk probably for an hour or more about each individual siddhi, but this one that you're discussing right now, the ability to take pain and convert it into pleasure, my goodness, the applications of that would seem to me to be enormous.
True. I mean, acupuncture tries that as well. I mean, acupuncture tries to numb us through use of the pressure points in the system of nadis or the channels through which vital energy flows. But yoga is a very vast field, and some of these exercises and some of these schools will tell you that whatever you can achieve through external means can be achieved through internal means. In other words, you can visualize and have power over your body just through internal meditation.
Well, back in the days when I practiced psychotherapy,
Right.
When I lived in California and was licensed there, I had a client who was in extreme pain from crippling disease. He was confined to a wheelchair, and the spine was stenosis. All the nerves were getting pinched, and we worked with hypnosis. And I discovered working with this lady that if she could direct compassion to her own body so she could experience the pain she was in with compassion, then the pain changed.
Wonderful. Very interesting. Yes.
Yeah.
And I think these kind of methods, which are psychological methods, in some ways are coming very close to the yogic methods.
It was, in effect, teaching her to love the pain, to treat it with tenderness and compassion instead of I hate the pain. That kind of makes it worse.
Right. Exactly. And it builds that bliss component. It builds a kind of an aura of pleasure, which, or of love, of compassion, that has its effect, a reverse effect on the nerves and what the input that they're giving. And
when you consider the billions of dollars that people spend on painkillers every year, I think a high percentage, I'm going to say probably a third of the population is taking painkillers.
Indeed. Yeah.
So the application of this yoga principle could have vast economic implications, although the pharmaceutical industry might not be so happy. But
True.
If I can imagine the day might come when we move into an era where people rely more on their own inner resources. And
absolutely, I agree. That's absolutely true, Jeff. I think Aldous Huxley was looking at that kind of a future. He looks at both sides of it. He looks at the side where these kinds of subjective practices can be utilized by, a kind of a sort of a conditioning agent by, in his book, Brave New World, where you find that people are conditioned both by external as well as by internal, means. And then the utopic last book, Island, where he's looking at these kind of measures, or devices that are being used to create a utopic society. So I think the future holds this kind of possibility for us.
Well, I know immortality is another one of these siddhis. And Aurobindo himself was really striving for that.
I think he was. He was striving for that. And he talks about that in terms of stages. So there are various stages. It doesn't necessarily mean that if one dies, one has not achieved the goal. Because the goal is something that one works towards. And there are a number of possibilities through which one has to, or hoops, through which one has to travel. I'd say some of these stages include being conscious in the process of dying, or transiting from the physical to the astral, as we were discussing, in a completely conscious manner, being able to choose one's birth. Now, these kind of ideas are very old. The Buddha himself, when we think about the way in which he was born, they say that he was born in a way immaculately. That just like Christ. But in the Buddhist canon, they're looking at this as a yogic achievement. The fact that he was already a siddha is what enabled him to do this. So these are stages of conscious passage from one life to another. And ultimately the ability to take the experience of one life consciously, not through a death, but through a transition into another life, and then perfecting that instrument till it comes to a point that it can actually regenerate itself.
It requires being able to think of oneself as being larger than just this particular lifetime.
Right. And then, what is death? In a sense, Sri Aurobindo has a line in his book, The Synthesis of Yoga. It goes something like this. The condition of a material immortality is to be reborn continuously, So we actually are reborn from one life to another. But in a way, we know today that old trees or even every human being, our cells are dying and being reborn.
Yes.
And so, in a sense, that is even in science, we see that is one of the real problems, that cell division stops at a certain point. Mm-hmm. And then that particular system dies if it can't be reborn.
Yeah.
So if we have the power of regenerating our body consciously, then there is a constant death and rebirth process that we're going through.
In other words,
and that is physical immortality.
To my understanding, every cell in our bodies gets replaced maybe in about 7 years.
Right.
We're not the same person at all.
We're not the same person, right. But it stops at a certain point, and that's the reason that we can't continue.
Live forever. Yeah. That's why people age.
That's right.
The cells reproduce imperfectly.
Right, exactly.
These siddhis are largely overlooked in Western culture.
Right.
To what extent would you say the people today living in India, where there are now 1 billion people, to what extent do they treat these ideas seriously?
I think, as you brought out earlier, Jeff, due to colonization and due to modernity and now due to neoliberal globalization, a certain kind of ontology, a certain state of being is spreading all over the world. And that is a major influence in kind of making these things recede to the background, so that people growing up in urban centers today are not in touch with these things, don't even have these as possibilities for exploration. They're not encouraged to explore it. On the other hand, we may say that nationalism is rising in many places in the world today, including in India, so that there is a kind of on the flip side of the ethnocentrism of kind of nationalism. There is also the revisiting of traditions of the past.
Yes.
So hopefully, due to this kind of process, which is really a Janus-faced process, we might begin to see again a kind of interest in some of the gifts of traditions that can be brought into the present.
There's a real paradox.
It is a paradox.
There, I consider myself a liberal. When you talk about neoliberalism, I think there are many wonderful things to say about it, but neoliberal globalization, there are many viewers of this program who are oriented towards this right-wing nationalism, towards which I personally feel no affinity.
I agree.
At all. But I know they're interested in the paranormal. They're interested in these ancient traditions.
Yes.
And I welcome them. I'm happy to have them as viewers. So to me, it's kind of paradoxical.
Both sides are paradoxical. Liberalism leads to neoliberal globalization, the importation of multinational corporations all over the world, and the taking over, in a sense, of indigenous knowledges. But on the other hand, you have right-wing nationalism, which stereotypes cultures and pits them against one another, makes them feel superior, and brings back, in a sense, a lot of the evils that we thought we had left behind after the Second World War.
Yes.
But a lot of that is coming back. But at the same time, it has this other side that it makes people look at their own traditions and revisit them, perhaps for integrating them into a more kind of universal culture of the future.
Because the conventional liberal point of view about the siddhis is that it's all superstition, which right. I reject.
Yes, me too. Indeed.
And that is, I suppose, at least along that line, is how there's a certain alignment between what I'm doing here and right-wing politics.
Yes.
And I suppose, though, one does have to ask, is there superstition involved? To what extent? It's not as if there's no superstition.
Yes, I think that's exactly where we have to bring the best of the two traditions together. Mm-hmm. And that's where I look at people like William James, mm-hmm. or I look at people like Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo, mm-hmm. that tried to bridge this gap, mm-hmm. and find new methodologies, whereby we don't look at this as traditions of superstition, but we can explore, we can experiment, mm-hmm. and we can enlarge our possibilities by looking at traditions. How can we bring the past and the future together? How can we bridge them? Mm-hmm. And I think that is part of a new science.
Maybe a new siddhi.
A new siddhi.
I mean, Aurobindo, as you point out, talked about balance, the need to balance between Vedanta and Tantra.
That's right.
It's not so dissimilar from the need to balance between liberalism and right-wing nationalism.
Yeah, or science and superstition, or science, mm-hmm. and I wouldn't say superstition. I'd say traditions that are difficult to accept rationally.
The world is being torn apart by many different forces, and it seems to me that this siddhi of balance that we've been talking about is called for. It's necessary, and it could lead to greatness.
Right, exactly, Jeffrey. And so going back to the scheme, one of the siddhis, or one of the disciplines, is the discipline of balance. Mm-hmm. The same one that's the discipline of peace. Which is it's called the Shanti Chatushta, the Quartet of Peace. Mm-hmm. An alternate name for it is Samata Chatushta, which means the Quartet of Balance. Mm-hmm. And the four goals of this are a progression. So it starts with Samata, which means equality or balance. The second one is Shanti, which is peace. Mm-hmm. The third one is Sukham, which is contentment or happiness. And the fourth one is Hasya, which means laughter. Mm. And so again, we see that the four are split into two Vedantic and two Tantric. So Samatha and Shanti, equality or balance and peace, belong to the world of Vedanta, while happiness and laughter belong to Tantra. Mm-hmm. And so and they are a progression. What he's saying is that if we can maintain perfect balance, then things align themselves in a way in which they deepen into peace. Mm-hmm. And as the peace gets deeper, we start experiencing happiness. Mm-hmm. And when the happiness is perfectly firm, then we experience laughter. Everything is bursting with joy. So I think that that's a certain progression which is, being called for today.
Yeah. Now, it happens that at the time we're recording this discussion in May of 2019. I hope this video will be available for a long time on the internet. But right at this moment, there was an election in India. We just heard the news.
Yeah.
The right-wing nationalist Hindu party is a pretty much firm control of India. Are they interested in the siddhis that we've been discussing?
Yes, there's a possibility that there'll be a kind of a revival of interest in yoga, because one of the ways by which this present party, the party that has been returned to power, it had the mandate of the people already, and it has returned to power. One of the ways in which it is looking at identifying the nation, I mean, a brand identity for the nation is yoga. Because indeed yoga is one of the gifts of India to the world. but it hasn't really looked deeply at what yoga implies. It's still looking at yoga more or less from the viewpoint of the universal yoga studio culture, physical yoga. But all the possibilities of yoga, can they be explored? Can that be a kind of a promotion? It's a possibility that this government will help in that direction.
Well, that would be interesting.
That certainly would be interesting.
I have to say this discussion is making me feel a little warmer toward these political movements. And I suppose that's a good thing.
I guess we have to make a virtue of necessity.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Well, Debashish, this has been a fascinating conversation. I know we could go on for a long time. We've hardly begun to enumerate all of the different cities, and it really would require a lot of time.
Absolutely. But I enjoyed this conversation with you, Jeffrey, and I think we covered quite a lot of ground.
We covered quite a lot, and I'm very grateful that you were able to come to Albuquerque, and I want to invite you back because I know that there's much, much more to talk about.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I look forward to it.
Thank you, and thank you for being with us.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download all 8 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.